Welcome to Chapter 7. This first video is on different angles. So we're going to cover some of 7.1 and 7.2 together and look at all the vocab we need to know for the different types of angles. Okay, so our targets here are that we can recognize and apply the properties of vertical and adjacent angles and solve for missing angle measurements. So what do these look like? What does it mean? And then if an angle is missing in a picture, can we find out how big it is? We're also going to cover looking at complementary and supplementary angles. And again, find for a missing angle measurement in those pictures. So there's 4 types of angles we have to be able to recognize: vertical, adjacent, complementary, and supplementary. So these are actually 7.1, these are 7.2, but we're going to cover them together. And with any types of angles, we have to be able to set up an equation and solve if there's an angle missing in the picture. Okay, so I'm going to put this up for a minute. This is just a little bit of angle review. Let's take a look at this one first. If it's less than 90, we call that an acute angle. And you've seen all this before. These are probably not new words for you, but we want to make sure we kind of have an idea in our head of how big these angles are. So acute, less than 90. Right is exactly 90 degrees, and it looks like the corner of a piece of paper, right? Or where the wall meets the floor. That's a right angle. Obtuse is more than 90, so notice it's opened up past that 90. A straight angle is 180 degrees, so it makes a straight line. And then this one, the reflex angle, we won't see very often, but that's this bigger side, so even bigger than 180 degrees. So just have an idea of how big these angles are, because we're going to start using them and measuring, and we want to make sure we have reasonable answers. So this will help you if you have a good idea of what the angles look like. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about our vocab words. There's 5 vocab words. The first one is vertical, or vertical angles. Okay, so this is different than a line that goes up and down, which is another definition of vertical. But vertical angles are across from each other, tip to tip. So like these 2 angles here, angle 1 and angle 3, they're in pink. Those 2 are vertical angles. They're tip to tip, and they share a vertex. They share that point in the middle. Okay, so in this picture, I wrote down angle 1 and angle 3 are an example of vertical angles. Adjacent. Adjacent angles share a wall and a vertex. So, for an example, my classroom is adjacent to Mrs. Smarch's room because we share a wall, right? We're next to each other sharing a wall. So adjacent angles are next to each other sharing a wall. So angle 1 and angle 2 share this wall right here. So they are adjacent angles next to each other sharing a wall. So I wrote down angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. Okay? Our next vocab word, complementary. Complementary. So complementary means 2 angles that add up to 90 degrees. So here you can see angle 6 and angle 7 put together make this right angle, right? We know that box in the corner means we have a right angle. So these 2 together equal 90 degrees. Now, I've shown them in this example where they are adjacent. They share this wall in the middle. But you could have 2 angles that are not adjacent, like angle 1 and angle 2, and if they still add up to make 90, they can be complementary. So complementary angles do not have to be adjacent. But if we see angles like this that make a right angle, they will be complementary. Okay, supplementary. Supplementary means 2 angles that add up to 180 degrees. And we know 180 degrees is this straight line. So if I have 2 angles next to each other that make a straight line, like this, then angle 8 and angle 9 are supplementary. Whatever those values are, it would add up to 180 degrees. Okay? So again, they don't have to be adjacent. They don't have to be sharing a wall. But if they are 2 angles sharing a wall that make a straight line, we know they're going to be supplementary. I could also have 2 angles that are not adjacent, angle 1 and angle 2, as long as those two values add up to 180, those would be supplementary. Okay, and then our last vocab word is congruent. Congruent. And congruent means equal measure. So if we're talking about line segments, it would be two line segments that are the exact same length. If we're talking about angles, it would be two angles that are exactly the same shape or the same number of degrees. Okay? You could have congruent shapes, congruent angles, congruent lines. Just means equal measure, equal size, equal measure. So there's a symbol for congruent that's actually an equal sign with a little squiggle on top of it. So when you see that, it means congruent, equal measure. So I want to go back up to the top of the vocab section here. This says 2 words for each picture. You're going to see this kind of question a lot where they give you a picture and ask you, okay, what vocab words do you see here? So whenever I see these 2 intersecting lines that kind of make an X, I know I have the angles across from each other, tip to tip, and I know those are vertical angles. Okay, so I would write down vertical. And I also know vertical angles are always congruent. These 2 angles, angle 1 and angle 3, the vertical angles in this picture, are congruent with each other. They're the exact same measure. They have to be. Okay? I could also say angle 2 and angle 4 are congruent. And I could write it like this. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. They are going to be the exact same measure as well. Okay? Anytime you see vertical angles, they're going to be the exact same size. The next picture, if I had to give 2 vocab words for the next picture, again, we said this was an example of complementary angles. If I can get my Post-it note up. Complementary angles, and because they share this side in the middle, they are also adjacent, sharing a wall. Okay? And I recognize the complementary angles because they make that right angle. And then 2 vocab words for down here. Again, we kind of already said this when we went over it, but in this picture I see supplementary angles, and again, they share a wall, so they are also adjacent. Okay? Because they share that wall. So you're going to look at lots of pictures and need to be able to identify what types of angles you see and what vocab words might go with that picture. Okay, so again, we know vertical angles are tip to tip. Adjacent angles are next to each other, sharing a wall. Complementary angles put together equal 90. They might be attached and adjacent like this, or they might be separate. Supplementary angles add up to 180. So again, they might be attached, adjacent, where they make a straight line, or they might be separate, as long as they add up to 180. And then congruent, equal size, equal measure. Okay? And we know how to label any of these pictures if we see them with the correct vocab words. Okay, I'm down at the very bottom of the page now. I want to look at this picture first. These are some questions you might see on a test or a quiz. This first part is just a drawing of some intersecting lines, and they might ask you, for example, find a pair of vertical angles. So if I'm looking for the vertical angle that goes with 5, I would look for the one directly across from it, tip to tip. So 5 and 7 are examples of vertical angles. Or what goes with angle 4? Well, directly across from it, tip to tip, these 2 would be vertical angles. So 4 and 2 are a pair of vertical angles. So we have to be able to look at a picture and identify vertical angles. What about supplementary angles? Well, I'm going to point back up here. Here's an example of supplementary angles, 2 angles that make a straight line. So let's look at 6. What could go with 6 to make a straight line? Well, in this case, there's actually a couple options, but let's just find one. If I draw a straight line here, 5 and 6 make a straight line. So I could say 5 and 6. Or if I'm looking at what could go with angle 4, I could draw a line here, and then angle 1 and angle 4 make a straight line. So again, I can look at the picture and find the pair of supplementary angles that would go together. So the final thing I want to point out in this section is that they might give you a set of angles, a pair of angles, and ask you if it's complementary, supplementary, or neither. And your job is just to add them up and see if it equals 90, right? If that equals 90, they will be complementary. If they add up and equal 180, they'll be supplementary. And if they add up and equal anything else, then they'll be neither, okay? So you can grab your calculator or do it in your head. 64 plus 26, if I add those together, I do get 90. So I would label these as complementary. Okay, this one, 44 and 136. If I add those together, they equal 180. So I know those are supplementary. And then 70 and 19 equals 89 if I add those together, so that is neither, right? So just being able to add angles up and recognize, does that give you complementary angles, supplementary angles, or neither? So that's this first video.